Relapsed, a Supervillain Rehabilitation Project short story. Prequel to Reformed. Written by H.L. Burke. Narrated by Rena Gail. Sirens blared and emergency vehicle lights flashed in the parking lot of the office building. Fade gazed over the crowd control barriers while Alay, the superhero assigned to keep Fade from going rogue, spoke with the non-superpowered authorities. Manifest, a 22-year-old former villain with force field powers, sidled up to Fade.
"Do you think we're going to get sent in?"
he asked, brushing a stray lock of dark hair off his tanned forehead. Fade shrugged.
"Probably."
A Channel 2 news van rolled up to the scene, so Fade pulled the hood of his jacket up over the dark skin of his shaved head. No point in giving the paparazzi an easy shot.
"I doubt Dosa can get another Sable team here in time. Alay's scoping the place out. He'll tell us what we need to do."
While officially a branch of the Department of Super-Abled, the Supervillain Rehabilitation Project, or SVR for short, was not particularly well thought of by heroes as a whole. Normally, the former villains under Alay's oversight were assigned missions nobody else wanted, or that the higher-ups trusted them not to fumble. Even though Fade had worked as a hero for nearly 2 years, the higher-ups considered him high risk for relapse. The SVR was at best an experiment. Most Dosa Sables, slang for super-abled, believed supervillains should be locked away for good, not rehabilitated and turned into heroes. Now, however, his team was faced with a high-profile hostage situation in a Dosa-related facility, one of their research labs, and no other Dosa teams were close enough to respond. Alay walked back to his charges, a normie police officer following close behind. About 20 years older than 26-year-old Fade, Alay had a short, well-trimmed beard and blonde hair with white wings. Normally his blue eyes twinkled, but now they matched his solemn expression. Fade stood up a little straighter.
"What's up, Doc?"
Manifest grinned. Fade rolled his eyes. Manifest could never take anything seriously. The idiot had always been more a prankster than a serious villain. He'd once used his powers to herd a flock of angry geese into a government office building and keep them there. Goose crap everywhere, and a lot of angry bureaucrats with expensive dry cleaning bills after that one.
"Officer Green was filling me in on the situation. We've identified the villain we're working against. It's Fryer."
Alay pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He unfolded this to reveal a printout of the building's floor plan with a room circled.
"He's got 4 or 5 Dosa agents in this back conference room, along with the prototype for Professor Genuine's latest power cell."
Fade arched his eyebrows.
"Fryer? Do we know what his endgame is? He's not usually the hostage-taking sort."
While Fryer had a reputation, it was small time. He'd emerge every so often to blow up a cell tower or try to EMP strike a power station, usually leaving behind a manifesto about how the government was spying on him and everyone else through cell phones and social media, which, from being in and out of Dosa's systems throughout his life, Fade knew was completely true, but it didn't make Fryer any less crazy. Sane people didn't demolish civilian targets to make their points.
"No, unfortunately, he's usually the blow-crap-up sort."
Alay grimaced.
"Which is why our priorities today are to first get the hostages out before he has a chance to do just that. Second, we secure the power cell prototype, because Dosa is going to implode if they lose something they sunk that many taxpayer dollars into."
Alay stood up straighter, his voice taking on a get-to-work edge to it.
"Third, we want Fryer alive if at all possible. This is a big score for someone who is mostly focused on small-scale anti-tech terrorism. There's a high chance he's working for someone."
The police officer cleared his throat, causing all eyes to snap to him.
"Excuse me, sir, but with all due respect, shouldn't we wait for a real Dosa team to handle this?" "Last I checked, I wasn't imaginary,"
Fade said dryly. In response, Officer Green stared pointedly at Fade's ankle, where the Dosa-issued power disruptor and tracking anklet was clipped. Fade shifted uncomfortably. He hated the disruptor. It always made him feel like his foot was asleep, not being able to access his powers in that section of his body.
"My team is well trained and has handled situations far more dangerous than this, but thank you for your concern, Officer Green."
Alay reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote control. He clicked 2 buttons, and the power disruptors on both Fade and Manifest's ankles fell to the ground. Alay collected the metal coils and tucked them away in his jacket pocket.
Tell your men to move the crowds further away from the building. We don't know exactly what Friar's planning, but he's been known to use explosives in the past.
Officer Green wrinkled his nose at Fade and Manifest, but gave a sullen,
"Yes, sir,"
and hurried off to obey orders.
"Are you able to read Friar?"
Fade asked.
"We should be within range here, right?" "I can read him to an extent."
Alay grimaced. His mind-based powers included emotional manipulation and mind reading.
"He's all over the place, brain having an argument with itself."
He winced and rubbed his forehead.
"I can't stay in it too long. Man, the guy needs help. Like, I'm not trying to be funny. It's sad how much he needs help. I pray we can bring him in alive, but in the state he's in..."
He let out a long breath.
"We need a safety net. Manifest, you go in with me from the front. Can you keep a force field up around both of us, strong enough to deflect his attacks?" "I should be able to."
Manifest nodded.
"Good. Fade, you ghost in from the back. Do you have your comm in place?" "Yep."
Fade tapped his ear, partially to double-check. Dosa-issued earpieces were small and light enough that he sometimes forgot if he had them in. He once fried one because he'd spaced out and didn't remove it before getting into the shower. Explaining that and having a new one issued had been a lot of paperwork he didn't want to repeat.
"Try to stay out of sight unless you absolutely need to make a move. I don't want to spook him, but if he tries to hurt someone, I want you there." "I've got your back,"
Fade said, and he meant it. Fade didn't care much for heroism as a concept, but keeping Alay safe, that he cared about. Skirting the crowd to avoid drawing attention in case Friar had eyes on the outside, he made his way to the back of the building. If his understanding of the floor plan was right, the room he wanted was right on the other side of the wall.
"Fade, you in position?"
Alay's voice echoed over the comm.
"Yeah, how about you?"
Fade had discovered early on in their association that his own powers made him one of the few people Alay couldn't track or read. A fact that had pleased Fade, who liked his privacy, but it did mean that during missions Alay had to do manual checks for Fade's location, rather than just scanning for his thought patterns.
"About to go in,"
Alay responded. Fade drew his powers around him and took a deep breath. The energy shimmered through him until his body was no longer solid. With his whole being given to the Fade, he sprinted at the building, hit the wall, and sank right through it. He skidded to a halt in a small, dark space before allowing his body to grow solid again. Putting out his hand, he felt a stack of folding chairs and a shelf of plastic bottles, probably cleaning supplies, before his eyes adjusted to the faint light coming from the cracks around the door. He listened. In the distance, someone was crying. A woman. He hazarded opening the door a crack and gazed out into a conference room. A group of 5 people in lab coats huddled together against one wall. Their wide eyes tracked a balding man in a shiny black raincoat holding a metal rod in one hand and a silver disc with a glowing center in the other.
"Friar."
The door to the conference room opened, and Manifest and Alay strode in. Friar whirled to face them. Fade's body tensed, ready to run to his teammate's defense if needed. Lightning shot from the rod in Friar's right hand. Manifest threw out his hands, and a shield of golden light sprang up around him and Alay. The electricity impacted harmlessly against it. Several of the hostages shrieked. Ozone tainted the air, singeing Fade's airways. Friar faced the Dosa Sables, his whole body shaking. "Get out!" he snarled. "I'll use this!" He tore open his raincoat, and Fade's heart skipped a beat.
"Oh crap, he's wired to explode." "Easy."
Alay held up his hands.
"We just want to talk. It's David, isn't it?"
Fade's ears twitched. Calling a Sable by their given name rather than that of their public persona was a risky move. With some it could foster familiarity, but with others... "My name is Friar!" The villain thrust the rod in Alay's direction again. Fade winced. Apparently Friar wasn't feeling all that familiar. Fade considered his options. Alay's plan to talk Friar down still had a chance, but Fade wanted a backup plan just in case. His powers didn't allow him to become invisible, just to walk through things, but if he walked within the walls themselves, Friar wouldn't be able to see him changing positions. He didn't prefer to travel through solid objects for more than a foot or two. After a while, it started to take too much concentration to separate his own atoms from the atoms of the wall. If he pushed himself, though, he might be able to sustain it until he could get right behind Fryer. Grabbing Fryer and ghosting through the floor would get the explosives away from the hostages. Based on the plans, there was a parking garage under this section of the building.
All right, Fryer then,
Alay continued.
I know you don't want to harm anyone.
Fryer shuddered.
Get out of my head!
He screamed.
I know you! You're a mind reader! Get the hell out of my head!
Easy.
Alay blanched. He took a step back. Fade slipped into the wall. His senses were immediately muffled, but the voices came through, faintly.
You're not a murderer, though. We can help you find someone who will listen so you can control the voices in your head.
I don't need Dose's help with anything! They're the ones who do this to me! They're always watching! They're spies!
Those people behind you aren't spies.
Alay's soothing voice continued.
They're scientists.
Fade's muscles ached slightly as the particles of his body began to protest being in the same position as the particles of the wall. It slowed his movements, like he was pushing through jello.
All the same, do you know what this is? What this power cell is capable of? It's enough energy to power a city, or destroy it. Dosa can't be trusted with that kind of power. They'll kill us all. They'll ruin you. You think they care about you? I know you. You and your villain reforming project. Dosa doesn't care about saving villains. They'll just use them up and spit them out, lock them in boxes when their talents are no longer useful. Strap metal on them to steal their powers.
Fade's skin crawled. Why was this crazy guy making so much sense? Shaking it off, he pushed forward, positioning himself in the wall right behind the hostages, just a few feet from where Fryer now ranted. He slipped from the wall to behind a curtain hanging over one of the windows. No longer confined to the wall, his body relaxed, though he still maintained his fade. Peeking around the obstacle, he watched Fryer pace erratically.
They can't be trusted!
The villain's face turned bright red.
Maybe not, but I promise you can trust me.
Alay took a step forward. Manifest shadowed him, keeping the shield up. A scratching sensation itched at the edges of Fade's brain. He recognized the energy as Alay's powers. Forcing his natural protections to subside, he listened.
Manifest is going to knock the power cell clear of Fryer's hand, then cast an energy field over Fryer.
Alay's voice echoed in Fade's head.
His shields are strong enough to hold any blast from the energy in, but you need to be quick to grab the power cell.
Fade thought an affirmative and braced himself to jump. Alay and Manifest eased closer to Fryer.
Stop right there!
Fryer jabbed the stick at them.
I'd rather let this bomb go off and kill us all than let Dosa have this power cell. They can't be trusted.
Now!
Alay's voice snapped in Fade's brain. Manifest punched the air. A burst of energy crashed into Fryer's outstretched hand. The power cell fell to the ground, right next to the villain's feet. Not stopping to think, Fade dove for it, just as Manifest's second shield went up, trapping him inside a golden bubble of energy with Fryer.
Oh crap, I'm on the wrong side of the shield.
Panic jolted Fade's nerves. He scrambled to his feet. Fryer sent forth a wave of electricity. It bounced off the shield and washed back over both him and Fade. Pain seared through Fade, sending him crashing to his knees next to a convulsing Fryer. Fryer and Fade stared at each other. Rage crossed the villain's face, and he reached for a button on his wired vest.
Fade, get out of there!
Alay shouted. Fade snatched up the power cell, ghosting as soon as it was in his grasp. He slipped through the floor as the air around him erupted in fire. The pressure wave of the explosion swept through his faded being like a breath of air. The whole building shook. He propelled himself through the floor, landing in a crouch in the underground parking garage below the building.
I made it.
Relief coursed through him. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered. Fade drew several deep breaths, waiting to be sure the structure wasn't going to collapse on top of him before he released his powers. The lights stilled, and he stood from his crouch.
Frickin' terrorists.
He spat to no one in particular. Even during Fade's villain days, he'd had nothing but contempt for the ideologues who had no qualms about blowing themselves up and others in the name of a cause. He tapped on his comm, only to find it fried. Grunting, he pulled the earpiece out and tossed it on the ground. With his adrenaline flagging, his muscles weakened and his skin felt cold. Hopefully everyone in the room was all right. Usually Manifest's shields were enough to hold out against a simple explosion.
Killed himself, and almost me. For what?
He opened his hand and revealed a small disc with a blue glowing center. The hair on the back of his arm stood on end, and he froze. What had Friar said? Enough power to light a city or reduce it to dust. And this tiny thing? Fade turned it over in his hands. Sure, Friar had wanted it for nefarious purposes, but that sort of power could change the world. And control of that sort of power could change lives. Especially his. As a former thief, Fade was no stranger to interacting with valuable objects, but nothing like this. No, scores of jewelry, cash, and even corporate secrets had financed his lifestyle for months and even years at a time, between having to dump everything and flee when Dosa got too close. But this power cell had incalculable value. The sort that could allow him to disappear and stay disappeared while still having the funds to buy whatever he wanted. His heart rose to his throat. No more taking orders from Dosa, but also no more running small cons for chump change at the behest of bigger criminals. In the chaos of the explosion, and with his calm fried by Friar's attack, his team probably didn't know exactly where he was. Fade was one of the few people Alay couldn't track. Dosa would never find him again. He could melt into the confusion, slip through their perimeter with the power cell before they even realized he was gone. By the time they started looking for him, he could be miles from the city.
How quickly could I fence something like this? Finding a buyer who wants it for the financial gain rather than for the explosives would be doable, but how long would it take me to find someone with the resources? Once I do, I'd be free. Completely free.
Palms sweaty, he let his powers flicker in and out. Was he really ready to abandon the hero path? If he did this, there would be no going back.
Screw Dosa. What have they ever done but keep me on a leash? I'm not their attack dog.
The thought of Alay, of his claim to have faith in his team, twisted Fade's conscience.
But that's not real, right? I'm just part of the job, the assignment he needs to keep an eye on as a good Dosa soldier. He's nothing to me. This job is nothing to me. No, it's been too long since I looked out for myself. It's time I started again.
His feet didn't move, though. He stood, staring at the power cell as if waiting for it to tell him what to do.
This could buy me everything. My own island where no one would ever bother me. A ritzy apartment in any city in the world, safe behind a completely new identity. Hell, I could probably buy my own country with that sort of money.
His jaw tightened. He deserved this. After a life spent running and struggling, he finally had a score that could let him leave it all behind. A creak of hinges echoed in the cavernous space. Fade pivoted towards the noise, pulling the power cell against his chest. Manifest burst from the nearest stairwell. Upon seeing Fade, his face brightened.
You're all right! Do you have the power cell?
A weird feeling of lightness swept through Fade, followed by a pinch of regret. He held out the power cell.
Sweet!
Manifest sprinted to Fade and put his hand up for a high five. Fade unenthusiastically returned the gesture. Manifest tapped his ear to activate his comm.
Alay, I found him!
There was a pause.
Yeah, he's all right. You're all right, Fade, right?
Fade gave a curt nod.
Yeah, no harm done, of course. Guy dropped right through the floor and out of danger.
Manifest shot Fade an exaggerated glare, followed by a wink.
Oh yeah, and the power cell's secure too. Meet you at the rendezvous point?
Fade turned away. So much for his big plans. A few minutes later, they emerged into the courtyard outside of the building. Emergency vehicles with their lights flashing formed a perimeter to keep out the gawkers and gathering media. Alay's eyes lit up at his charge's approach.
Fade! Great work!
He hurried over and reached for the power cell. Fade managed to look nonchalant as he handed it over. What was one more broken dream at this point in his life?
And Friar?
He asked.
Only pieces left.
Manifest wrinkled his nose, then lifted up his foot.
I'm hoping I didn't get any of him on my shoes on my way out.
Alay clapped Fade on the shoulder.
When the explosion went off, I panicked for a minute, thinking you'd been vaporized, but Manifest assured me you just ghosted through the floor.
He turned the power cell over in his hands and gave a low whistle.
I hope this thing was worth all this trouble. At least the only life lost was Friar's.
Regret crossed his face. He shook his head, then motioned to a waiting helicopter.
Come on, let's get back to HQ. Dead villain plus explosion in a DOSA facility equals a lot of paperwork.
Manifest gave an exaggerated moan, but Fade wasn't in the mood to commiserate over mundane office tasks. He was silent through the flight. By the time the chopper touched down on top of their HQ, he still hadn't been able to push aside the fog that had settled over him. Alay led them back into the building and punched his code into the elevator for the story of the DOSA building allotted to the SVR, a plain set of offices and 2 bare-bones dorm rooms. Better than holding cells, Fade supposed, but only just barely.
I'll take care of the paperwork this time, boys,
Alay said as they entered the elevator.
You two deserve an afternoon off after this.
He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 2 metal coils. Fade stiffened. Power disruptors. The mission was over. It was time for the attack dogs to go back on their chains. Bitterness flooded him. Why hadn't he run when he had the chance? The elevator dinged. Alay shook his head and shoved the disruptors back in his pocket rather than attach them. Fade blinked. What was that about?
Like I said, if you two want to take a break... Powell, get over here!
At the sound of his civilian name, Alay spun around, mouth crinkled in displeasure. A broad-shouldered man in a black hood and mask barreled down the hallway, glare burning into Alay. Fade stiffened. What was the adjudicator doing here?
Sorry, guys.
Alay's voice dropped to a murmur.
Got to deal with the brass.
Manifest and Fade exchanged a glance before falling into step behind their leader, hanging back a little ways as he approached the adjudicator, one of the 3 current DOSA committee members. Talon, a middle-aged African-American man, followed close behind. Unlike the adjudicator, he dressed in a well-tailored but simple business suit. Feathers grew intermixed with his dark hair. Talon was also a committee member, one of the original 2, unlike the adjudicator, who was a fairly recent addition, after Congress had decided DOSA needed more bureaucracy than a 2-member leadership team provided.
What is it with your pet villains and property damage?
The adjudicator barked. Alay cleared his throat.
With all due respect, sir, we recovered the power cell and neutralized the threat with no civilian life lost, and the only one harmed was the perpetrator.
He exhibited the power cell.
Give me that.
The adjudicator snatched it.
Your orders were to bring in Friar alive. Now we'll never know who he was working for or what buyers he had lined up for this. What if whoever sent him just hires another goon to try again?
Maybe make your DOSA facilities secure enough that they can't be broken into by just any sable lunatic with half-assed electrical manipulation powers?
Fade said.
Just a thought.
Manifest choked on a laugh that turned into a cough as the adjudicator's exposed face reddened.
Easy, Frank,
Talon said, his deep, soothing voice marked with a light southern drawl. Fade cast the adjudicator a glance. Most sables saw referring to other sables by their civilian names, rather than their hero handles, as a bit of an insult, but between Talon's rank and old-school charm, he usually got away with it. The adjudicator's scowl eased.
We probably wouldn't have gotten anything concrete out of someone as unstable as Friar anyway.
Talon put out his hand. The adjudicator stiffened, but handed over the power cell. He then shot a glare at first Fade's, then Manifest's ankles.
The mission is over. Why aren't they in their power disruptors?
Alay again drew the disruptors out of his pocket. His brow furrowed, then he squared his shoulders and stared down the adjudicator.
Because my men just got through a mission that nearly cost them both their lives. Fade and Manifest have been with the SVR for nearly 2 years now, and in that time, they've shown exemplary service.
He turned from the adjudicator and addressed Talon directly.
Sir, I would like to state for the record that Fade and Manifest have proven their trustworthiness and request that we remove them from their probationary period and make them official DOSA heroes.
Fade gaped and Manifest grinned.
That's ridiculous,
the adjudicator blustered. Talon arched an eyebrow.
Are you sure, Kevin? Yes, these 2 have so far kept to the program, but of the 6 villains you started with, 4 have dropped out. Those aren't great odds. As much as I want the SVR to work, it's still an experiment, and if either of them backslides, it'll be on your record as their handler. I'm sure.
Alay's voice softened.
Look, I know the SVR was a risk, and yeah, I have failed to rehabilitate more villains than I've managed to keep in the program. But these two are working out. I'd stake everything on it. They have what it takes to be heroes.
Don't be a fool,
the adjudicator broke in.
They're trustworthy only because we've never taken our eyes off them.
Well, if that's the case, they're never going to prove themselves until we do.
Olay crossed his arms over his chest, then his face brightened.
Also, if we move Manifest and Fade out of their probationary period, it clears the SVR to take on new subjects. I have been keeping an eye on the villains we've brought in recently, and there are multiple candidates for reform. Villains out of their holding cells means less taxpayer dollars going to confinement tech.
Talon dropped his voice to a stage whisper, eyeing the adjudicator.
Plus, we can put out a press release about the success of one of our programs. Great PR.
The adjudicator's expression softened.
That is a thought.
He drew himself up taller again.
All right, I'll sign off on it.
It took all of Fade's willpower to bite back a sarcastic comment. For the most junior member of the committee, the adjudicator sure liked to throw his weight around. Talon offered him the power cell.
Do you want to do the honors of checking this into a secure facility? Maybe see if you can get a press conference booked to announce that it was recovered?
Of course, I'll prepare a statement.
The adjudicator took a step towards the exit, then paused, eyeing Talon.
You coming?
I'd like a minute to catch up with my old friend.
Talon put his hand on Alay's shoulder.
I'll be a minute.
The adjudicator nodded, then marched off. As soon as the adjudicator was gone, Alay groaned.
Why is that tool on the committee in the first place?
Talon snorted.
Officially, optics. It looks good to have at least one normie amongst the Sables. Off the record, his daddy pulled some political strings.
A faint smile crossed his face.
That could have been your seat, Kevin. You were my first pick, and politics or not, I would have fought for you to hold it. We're still looking for one more member. Shepard wants to bring in another woman, just to even things out, but if I called in a few favors, I could get her to yield on that. You want in?
Alay chuckled and shook his head.
This is where my heart's at, Jack. You know that.
He waved towards Manifest and Fade. Fade's insides twisted.
You still coming to dinner next week?
Alay moves the conversation on quickly.
Of course. Can't wait. Will Aiden and Lucia be there? Yep. They're looking forward to seeing you again, too. They are good kids.
Talon smiled.
See you then.
As he walked away, Alay turned and faced his two charges. He held out both the disruptors, offering one to Manifest and the other to Fade.
Hold on to these. They'll help you remember how far you've come.
The younger men took them, Manifest still beaming, though Fade just felt shell-shocked.
So we're official Tosa heroes now? All right!
Manifest laughed. He offered Fade a high five. Fade went through the motions. While he liked Manifest, they didn't have a lot in common. Manifest had pulled a few small heists and a lot of bad pranks using his powers. He might have flown under Dosa's radar if he hadn't posted videos of himself doing stupid stuff with his abilities. After a few months of criminal activity more akin to frat boy nonsense than actual villainy, Dosa had brought him in for a mix of convenience store thefts and drunken vandalism. The kid had barely been a villain in the first place, at least not compared to Fade. Fade had started as a thief in his early teens, using the funds he generated to support himself and escape the foster care system. He'd stayed with the life, making a bit of a name for himself in the villain community, until his final capture and eventual recruitment into the SVR. That Manifest could stay clean, Fade didn't doubt. Himself? Fade had nothing but doubts, especially after what had happened with the power cell.
You two deserve it. You did good today.
Alay clapped both men on the shoulders.
I'm proud of you. I'm just glad I got it worked out with the committee.
His eyes then zeroed in on Fade.
Are you all right? You're acting off. Not every day a guy blows up in front of me.
Fade forced a shrug. Pity crossed Alay's face.
It's never easy.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From this, he removed a card.
Dosa pays for trauma counseling for a reason. If you need someone to talk to, the people on this line are good. Of course, I'm also here. Thanks.
Fade took the card, just to keep Alay from pushing the matter.
I might later, but now I'm gonna go watch some TV. Sounds like a plan. I'm going to try and finish up the reports, so I can do the same.
Alay rubbed the back of his neck.
Hero work I can handle, but dang, I think the politics will drive me to an early grave. Speaking of things that will probably kill me, I have paperwork to file.
With one last smile, he headed down the hall and entered his office.
Score!
Manifest punched the air.
Unofficial Dose hero! I'm gonna go call my mom and let her know.
You do that.
Fade scoffed. Manifest strolled off, leaving Fade alone with his thoughts. What had just happened? Fade stared down at the power disruptor. It lay lifeless in his hand like a dead snake. Somehow he still felt as if it could leap up and bite him. His grip tightened around it, guilt and doubt churning in his soul, before he gritted his teeth and ghosted through the wall into Alay's office. The older man looked up from his computer and blinked.
What if I told you about knocking?
Fade's ears warmed.
Sorry.
He shifted from foot to foot. Alay's sincere blue eyes searched him.
You change your mind about talking? I don't deserve this.
Fade dropped the disruptor onto Alay's desk before he could reconsider. Once he'd said it, the tension within him eased, only to be replaced by a quiet, simmering shame.
Sir, what you said about me being trustworthy, about how I've proven myself, you're wrong.
Alay tilted his head to one side.
And what brought you to this conclusion?
Fade hung his head.
I was about to take the power cell for myself when Manifest arrived. If he hadn't shown up when he did, I would have pocketed it and faded out of there. When I got my hands on it, all I could think was how it would be the score of a lifetime, and I should just take it and bug out. I was that close.
Alay scratched at his beard, then stood up from his chair, pocketing the disruptor.
Want to take a walk?
Fade blinked.
A walk? Not far, just around the courtyard. Give us a chance to talk outside of Dose's oversight.
Fade swallowed. This wasn't the reaction he expected.
Sure, I guess.
The two men left the office. They navigated down a few flights of stairs and through the lobby in silence. Fade watched Alay out of the corner of his eye as they walked. He'd expected a dressing down, to have the disruptor clapped back on his ankle at the very least, but perhaps even for Alay to send him back to his holding cell. Instead, the man was quiet, calm. Outside, a large courtyard surrounded a fountain that rhythmically shot bursts of water into the air. Alay led Fade to a bench facing the water and sat down. Fade kept standing. Fade wished he had Alay's mind-reading powers. It would have been nice to know what he was thinking. Not knowing what his fate would be made Fade's stomach roil. Even if Alay wasn't angry, he had to know that what Fade had confessed to required consequences. Fade couldn't take the silence any longer.
Aren't you going to do something about what I told you? No.
Alay chuckled.
The fact that you were tempted to take it, but didn't, but still felt you had to come to me about it, isn't exactly a point against you, in my opinion. But I would have if Manifest hadn't. Manifest's powers are nothing compared to yours, Fade. He's a good team member, sure, but in a fight, or even just if you wanted to escape him, he wouldn't have had a chance at stopping you. You might have told yourself you didn't take it because of Manifest, but you didn't take it because you didn't want to go back to your old life.
Fade considered this. His reaction when Manifest had entered the room had definitely been more relief than disappointment. Still, he'd been so close to backsliding.
Sit down. I can't think with you hovering over me like a brooding flagpole.
Alay patted the bench. With a sigh, Fade settled onto it. His heels tapped anxiously against the pavement beneath him.
I almost get the feeling that you want me to punish you,
Alay continued. Fade grimaced. Of course he didn't. That made no sense. What sort of logical human being wanted to be punished? Even now his muscles tensed at the thought of the disruptor going back on his leg, of being unable to access his full abilities, of being trapped. But that last part, the feeling of being trapped, that was Dose life as a whole. If he stayed with the SVR, he'd always be trapped. Maybe not as obviously as when he wore the disruptor or had to sleep in a holding cell, but by their regulations and procedures, by the chain of command, by them being aware of and in control of every aspect of his life. His heart rate spiked, and again he regretted not grabbing the power cell and making a break for freedom.
I'm not going to be able to stick this out. Today wasn't the first time I've wanted to run. It's just the first time I had the opportunity. But again, you didn't. But I will! Fade snapped. It's who I am, LA. It's who I'll always be. I can pretend to be a hero, but I'm not like you or Talon or even Manifest. I'm a villain because I don't have a reason not to be. It's what I'm good at. Sure, I always hated being on the run, but I hate being locked down even more.
He rubbed his suddenly aching forehead.
It's only a matter of time before I can't take it anymore, and in that moment, I can't promise you I won't leave if there isn't something like the Disruptor holding me down. I see.
Alay's shoulders rose and fell in a great sigh.
Fade, what to you is the difference between a villain and a hero?
Fade narrowed his eyes at his superior. Was that a trick question?
One does crimes, the other tries to stop them. So just different sides in a game? Like kids playing tag?
Alay smirked.
If that's how you see it, I'm not really surprised that you have a hard time latching onto Dosa life. You're a thinker. You need more reason than that. Not to get philosophical, but what do you think about the concepts of right and wrong?
Fade let out a long breath.
They exist. I mean, I'm not a moral authority by any means, but I promised myself I wasn't going to take jobs that would hurt people, because that's not who I want to be. I'm not a murderer, just a thief. I would argue that you haven't been a thief for a few years now, but putting that aside, why in your head is it all right to be a thief, but not a murderer?
Fade faded his fingers in and out of the bench, fidgeting with his powers to try and focus his brain.
I guess neither of them is right. One's just a level of not right I'm comfortable with, which is another reason I don't really trust myself to stick to this, because I'm comfortable with a lot of things that aren't right. But what makes them not right to you? Well, for starters, they're against the law.
Fade snorted. Alay nodded.
But that hasn't stopped you in the past, and it likely won't stop you again. I think what you're searching for is a moral anchor. Everyone needs one. For some people, it's the rule of law, but you're too much of a questioner to blindly accept Dosa's authority on something that broad. Is that why you chose the hero life? The rule of law?
Fade considered Alay.
No.
Alay rubbed at his upper arm, where Fade knew a tattoo of a cross was hidden by his long sleeves.
Religious reasons?
Fade pressed.
That's a large part of it for me.
Alay nodded.
I could get in trouble if someone thinks I'm proselytizing on Dosa time, but yeah. I grew up in the church, fell away for a while in high school, then recommitted myself and got baptized in the Gulf right before I accepted the genetic manipulation experiments that led to, well, this.
He waved at the looming Dosa headquarters.
It does keep me on the path, believing there's a greater power I'm accountable to and need to live to honor. And no offense, but I'm not sure I'll ever be the religious type.
The last thing Fade wanted was more rules and restrictions. Doses were hard enough to bear without bringing God into it.
Maybe not, but you need something, Fade. As you've said, you're willing to do things you know are wrong. If you don't have a reason beyond Dosa told me not to, then maybe you're right. Maybe you're not going to be able to keep this up long term.
Something in Fade twisted.
Is there something wrong with me? Am I just doomed to always be one step away from the villain path? I need something. I can't live like this. Is your faith the only reason you're with Dosa?
He asked.
No, but my other reason won't be of much help to you either.
Alay reached into his back pocket and drew out his wallet. From this, he pulled out a crinkled photograph. 2 teens, both with his blonde hair and blue eyes.
I want them to be proud of me. I want them to have a better life, live in a world that's a little bit safer and fair because of what I've done.
Fade considered the picture.
Yeah, family isn't a thing for me either.
A dead mom, an unknown father, and bouncing from foster home to foster home had prevented him from developing long-term relationships. Outside of Alay, and maybe a slight camaraderie with Manifest, he didn't have anyone.
You're young yet. It might very well be someday.
Alay clapped him on the shoulder before returning the photograph to the wallet and the wallet to his pocket.
I'd like you to meet mine someday, at the very least. They're both Sables, but I'm keeping them out of Dosa's way until they finish school and are old enough to make their own call on whether it's what they want to do. But I already know Lucia is going to join Dosa. She'll be 18 this December, and she's picked out her hero handle and is working on uniform concepts.
He laughed.
She is a lot like her mom, all gung-ho and ready to go no matter what the risk to herself.
Pain crossed his face.
I just hope well, you can't always keep everyone safe, no matter how much you want to. Sorry,
Fade mumbled. He stared down at his shoes. Maybe religion wouldn't be so bad. It kept Alay going, and he respected Alay. Still, Alay was a good guy, a loving father, a patient teacher. Fade didn't think he had it in him to be Alay. He didn't think he had it in him to be anything but what he was, and what he was, he'd screwed up so many times. A hand gripped his shoulder. Surprise cut through him. Turning his head, he found Alay gazing at him, his eyes piercing. Fade squirmed.
Look, if you need something, at least in the short term to keep you going, do it for me. Because maybe you don't have faith in a god or in yourself, but believe it or not, Fade, I have faith in you. I try not to have favorites in this game, but I'll admit, I think you're the best Sable I've trained. You may not trust yourself, but your heart for your team, your calm in the face of danger, the way you think for yourself, you have a lot of shining traits that I know can elevate you above what you think you are.
His hold on Fade's shoulder tightened.
I believe you can do this. I want to keep fighting alongside you for many years to come, and I will give you whatever help you need to get you to reach that goal. I promise.
Fade's throat constricted.
What if I let you down?
His voice came out raspier than he would have liked, and he quickly averted his eyes.
I pray you won't. In fact, I'll pray you find that anchor you need, whatever it might be, because once you do, you're going to be one of the best heroes Dosa has ever seen, someone who I hope my kids get a chance to work with.
Alay stood and drew the disruptor out of his pocket.
And this thing?
With a wink, he tossed it into the fountain behind them. It landed with a plunk and a quiet splash. Fade swallowed a laugh.
You know you just ruined a couple $100 of government property.
A mischievous smirk crept across Alay's face.
I guess I still have a little villain in me after all.
He stepped away from the fountain.
I'm feeling like pizza. You hungry? Want to grab a bite on me?
Fade stood.
I could eat. Let's go then.
Alay started across the courtyard. Fade hesitated, glancing at the fountain one last time. It would be a long path, and for him, not an easy one. But for Alay, maybe he could do it. Maybe having someone believing that he could be a hero was enough to make him one. It was at least enough to keep him trying. The end. Fade's story continues in Reformed, Supervillain Rehabilitation Project, Book 1. This has been Relapsed, a prequel of the Supervillain Rehabilitation Project. Written by H.L. Burke. Narrated by Rena Gail. Copyright 2020 by H.L. Burke. Production copyright by H.L. Burke. Thanks for listening.